For 6 years, I quietly paid for my family's biggest tradition without ever once being thanked for it out loud. I didn't mind. Gratitude was never why I did it. But the year my own son decided I wasn't welcome at that same tradition, I finally understood something important: generosity without respect isn't generosity at all. It's just a habit waiting to be broken. My name is Diane. I was 61 years old when I learned that the family gathering I had funded faithfully for 6 straight years could disappear in a single afternoon, the moment I stopped being willing to fund my own exclusion. Let me explain the tradition first, because it matters to everything that happened afterward. 6 years ago, after my husband Gerald passed away, our large extended family, nearly 40 people across 3 generations, started struggling to stay connected. Everyone was scattered across different states, busy with their own lives, drifting apart the way families sometimes do when no one takes responsibility for pulling everyone back together. I decided to fix that. I proposed an annual family reunion, 1 week every summer at a beautiful lakeside lodge in Michigan, a place Gerald and I had visited on our honeymoon decades earlier. I offered to cover the lodge rental completely, along with a significant portion of the shared meals and activities, simply asking family members to cover their own personal expenses and transportation. It became, over 6 years, the highlight of our entire family's calendar. Cousins who barely knew each other grew close. Grandchildren who lived in different states finally built real relationships with their extended family. My son Kevin, his wife Michelle, and their 2 children attended every single year, along with nearly everyone else across our extended family tree. I never asked for recognition for funding this tradition. I paid the lodge deposit quietly every January, handled the catering arrangements without fanfare, and simply enjoyed watching my family reconnect summer after summer. It felt like the most meaningful use of the resources Gerald and I had built together over our lifetime. Kevin married Michelle 4 years ago, 2 years after our reunion tradition had already begun. Michelle, from the very beginning, seemed to view these family gatherings differently than the rest of us. She often made comments about how old-fashioned the whole tradition felt, how she preferred smaller, more curated gatherings rather than a full week with 40 relatives under one roof. I understood, at least initially, that not everyone would love a large family tradition the way I did. Different people have different comfort levels with big, chaotic family gatherings. I tried to be understanding of that difference. But over the following years, Michelle's discomfort with the tradition slowly transformed into something else entirely: a quiet campaign to reshape the gathering according to her own preferences, delivered consistently through Kevin rather than through any direct conversation with me. Suggestions that the week should be shortened to a long weekend instead. Comments that certain difficult relatives, usually the ones with strong opinions or louder personalities, shouldn't necessarily be invited every year. Subtle pressure for the whole event to move somewhere more modern than the same lodge we'd used since the beginning. I resisted these changes gently but firmly for years, explaining that the tradition worked precisely because of its consistency, its inclusiveness, its willingness to hold space for every single relative who wanted to be part of it, regardless of how difficult or old-fashioned any individual personality might be. This year, that resistance apparently became too much for Michelle to continue tolerating. It was a Thursday evening in early May, about 6 weeks before our scheduled reunion week, when I discovered something that would change everything about how I understood my place within my own family's tradition. I was going through my phone, organizing photos from previous reunions to include in a slideshow I was planning to surprise everyone with that summer, when I accidentally opened a family group chat I hadn't realized my nephew had added me to years earlier. A smaller, separate chat used mainly by the younger generation of cousins for casual conversation. Scrolling through recent messages, searching for old reunion photos someone had shared, I came across a conversation from just 2 days earlier that stopped me completely. Kevin had written, "So just a heads up, this year's reunion is going to look a little different. Michelle and I decided it's time for a change in leadership, so to speak. We're taking over organizing everything from Mom this year." My niece Ashley had responded, "Oh wow, does Aunt Diane know?" Kevin's reply made my stomach drop. "We're handling it. Honestly, it'll probably be easier without her there this year anyway. Michelle and I already talked to the lodge, we're covering costs ourselves, and we think it'll actually go more smoothly without Mom's usual involvement." Without Mom's usual involvement. I read that phrase 3 times, trying to fully absorb what it actually meant. My own son was planning to take over the tradition I had built and funded for 6 years, using the lodge relationship I had personally established, while explicitly excluding me from the very gathering I had made possible in the first place. I continued scrolling, my hands shaking slightly, finding more messages that painted an increasingly clear picture. Kevin and Michelle had apparently been planning this leadership change for weeks, quietly reaching out to various family members, framing the shift as a natural evolution rather than what it actually was, an attempt to remove me from a tradition I had personally created, while still using every resource, relationship, and structure I had originally built. The most painful message came from my cousin Patricia, who had written, "As long as everyone still gets to come, I don't really care who's organizing it. Diane's done an amazing job for years, but change happens, I guess." Even the people who weren't actively part of the plan seemed prepared to simply accept my quiet removal without much thought, as if 6 years of generosity and effort could simply be replaced without consequence, without conversation, without even the basic courtesy of informing me directly before deciding it among themselves. I set my phone down that evening and sat in silence for a long time, processing what I had just discovered. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a small comment blown out of proportion. This was a deliberate, organized plan to exclude me from my own family's tradition, executed quietly behind my back, using resources and relationships I had personally built over 6 years of consistent generosity. I want to be honest about something here. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was a strange, hollow kind of sadness, the sort that comes from realizing something you deeply valued was never valued in quite the same way by the people you built it for. But sadness, I've learned throughout my life, has a way of eventually settling into clarity if you give it enough time and space to fully process. And clarity, once it arrived a few days later, showed me exactly what I needed to do next. I reached out carefully to a few trusted family members, my sister-in-law Carol and my niece Ashley, both of whom I knew would be honest with me without immediately reporting our conversation back to Kevin and Michelle. What I learned over that week painted an even clearer, more troubling picture than the group chat alone had revealed. Kevin and Michelle had apparently told several family members that I was stepping back from organizing this year by choice, implying I had voluntarily decided to reduce my involvement, rather than being deliberately excluded from a tradition I had built. They had also, according to Carol, contacted the lodge directly, attempting to transfer the reservation into their own names, though the lodge manager, whom I had built a personal relationship with over 6 years of consistent, reliable bookings, had apparently expressed some confusion about the sudden change and reached out to confirm with me directly, which is actually how I first learned that a call had even been attempted. This detail mattered enormously to me. Kevin and Michelle weren't simply planning to host a separate, smaller gathering somewhere else. They were attempting to take over the exact venue, the exact tradition, the exact structure I had built, while positioning themselves as the new hosts and quietly writing me out of a story I had personally authored from the very beginning. I also learned through Ashley that Michelle had been telling people privately that I was becoming too controlling about how the reunion should be run, that my resistance to changing the format was creating unnecessary tension, and that the family would actually benefit from fresh energy running things going forward. I understood, hearing all of this, that Kevin and Michelle weren't simply trying to attend a family reunion without me present for one particular year. They were attempting a complete takeover, using my money, my relationships, my carefully built tradition, while simultaneously rewriting the narrative to suggest I was the problem that needed to be removed for the family's benefit. I want to pause here and explain something important about my thought process during that week. I genuinely considered simply stepping back gracefully, letting Kevin and Michelle take over the tradition entirely, telling myself that perhaps it was simply time for a new generation to lead, that maybe I was holding onto something I should have already let go of naturally. But the more I thought about it, the more clearly I understood something crucial. This wasn't actually about generational transition. If Kevin and Michelle had approached me honestly, expressing genuine interest in eventually taking over organizing responsibilities, discussing the transition openly and respectfully, I would have happily supported that natural evolution. What actually happened was fundamentally different. This was an attempted erasure, executed through secrecy and quiet manipulation of the extended family's understanding of the situation, rather than honest, direct conversation about a tradition I had personally built and financially supported for 6 consecutive years. Once I understood that distinction clearly, my path forward became equally clear. I decided during that difficult week of gathering information that I would allow Kevin and Michelle's plan to proceed exactly as they had designed it, with one crucial difference. I would simply stop being the invisible financial foundation supporting a tradition I was being deliberately excluded from. I want to explain my reasoning clearly because I understand this might sound harsh to some people hearing this story. For 6 years, I had personally covered the lodge deposit, the majority of shared meal costs, and various activity expenses for our family reunion, totaling a significant amount of money each year. I never expected recognition for this generosity, and I never would have withdrawn my support simply because Kevin and Michelle wanted to take over organizing responsibilities honestly and transparently. But I refused to continue quietly funding a tradition while being simultaneously erased from participating in it myself. That wasn't generosity anymore. That was simply being used. I contacted the lodge directly that week, confirming with the manager, whom I'd built genuine trust with over 6 years, that the reservation and deposit remained entirely under my name, exactly as it had been from the very beginning. I made clear that I had not authorized any transfer of the booking to anyone else, and that any changes to the reservation needed to go through me directly. I also made a decision about the deposit itself. Rather than canceling the reservation entirely, which would have disrupted the entire family's plans without giving anyone the chance to adjust accordingly, I decided instead to simply withdraw my financial commitment to the shared meals and activities, while allowing the lodge reservation itself to remain intact under my name for the scheduled week. This meant that when nearly 40 relatives arrived at that lakeside lodge for the reunion week, they would find the building itself accessible exactly as expected, but without any of the catered meals, organized activities, or covered expenses they had come to associate with the tradition over the previous 6 years. I didn't inform Kevin or Michelle about this decision directly. I decided, much like the situation itself had been handled with me, that they would simply discover the reality of the situation upon arrival, exactly as I had discovered their plans through an accidental scroll through a group chat I wasn't meant to see clearly. I did, however, quietly reach out to a handful of trusted family members. Carol, Ashley, and a few others I knew would appreciate understanding the actual situation before arriving at the lodge, explaining honestly what had happened and what they should expect financially for this particular year's gathering. I want to be clear about something important here. I wasn't trying to sabotage my extended family's reunion entirely. I genuinely hoped and still hope that the tradition itself could continue in some form going forward. What I refused to continue doing was invisibly funding my own exclusion from something I had built with genuine love and effort over 6 meaningful years. I spent the remaining weeks before the reunion in a strange, quiet state of clarity. I didn't feel angry exactly. I felt something more like resolve, the calm, steady understanding that comes from finally refusing to accept a situation that had been slowly, quietly unfair to me for longer than I had initially realized. The reunion week began on a warm Saturday in late June. I wasn't there, of course, having been explicitly excluded from attending. Instead, I spent that morning at home, receiving updates throughout the day from Carol and Ashley, who had agreed to keep me informed about how everything unfolded. According to Carol's first message, relatives began arriving at the lodge around noon, exactly as scheduled, carrying luggage, excited children, and the same warm anticipation that had characterized every previous year of this beloved tradition. Kevin and Michelle arrived early, apparently having planned to personally welcome everyone and oversee the new format of the reunion they had been organizing quietly for weeks. According to Carol, they seemed confident and prepared, having apparently arranged a slightly different activity schedule and mentioning plans for a welcome dinner that evening to kick off the week. The confusion began around 5 p.m., when the catering company I had used faithfully for 6 consecutive years arrived at the lodge, only to inform Kevin and the assembled family that no meal service had actually been booked or paid for that year. Kevin, according to Carol's message, appeared visibly confused, immediately attempting to contact the catering company directly, only to learn that the standing arrangement I had maintained for 6 years had been formally canceled several weeks earlier. Michelle, apparently, immediately suspected what had actually happened, though according to Carol, she initially tried to downplay the situation to the gathered family, suggesting it was simply an administrative mix-up that could be quickly resolved. But as the evening progressed, the full scope of the situation became increasingly clear to everyone present. The planned group activities, previously organized and covered by contributions I had arranged, hadn't been confirmed either. The lodge's recreational equipment, typically reserved specifically for our group through arrangements I had personally maintained, wasn't available because the standing reservation for those amenities had similarly lapsed. By early evening, according to Ashley's messages, nearly 40 relatives were gathered at a beautiful lakeside lodge with no organized dinner, no planned activities, and a growing, uncomfortable understanding that something significant had shifted about this year's tradition. Kevin, according to multiple family members who reached out to me directly that evening, spent much of that first night making increasingly frustrated phone calls, trying to arrange last-minute catering and activities, discovering quickly how difficult and expensive it was to organize accommodations for 40 people on short notice, especially during peak summer season at a popular lakeside destination. My cousin Patricia, the same relative who had written in that group chat that she didn't really care who was organizing it, sent me a message late that first evening. "Diane, is everything okay? Kevin seems really stressed and dinner never happened tonight. Some of the kids are getting cranky and hungry." I responded honestly, explaining briefly that I had decided to step back from funding the shared expenses this year, given the circumstances surrounding how the new leadership had been organized. I didn't elaborate extensively on the group chat discovery or the details of what Kevin and Michelle had attempted. I simply explained the basic truth. The reservation itself remained valid, but the financial support I had provided for 6 consecutive years was no longer something I felt comfortable continuing under the current circumstances. That first night of the reunion, according to everyone who reached out to me afterward, ended with confused, hungry relatives ordering delivery pizza for 40 people to a rural lakeside lodge. A chaotic, expensive, and thoroughly unglamorous start to what was supposed to be a carefully organized celebration. Kevin called me around 10 p.m. that first night, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion, frustration, and barely controlled anger. "Mom, what did you do?" he asked, skipping any greeting entirely. "Dinner never showed up. The activity coordinator says our reservation for the boats and equipment was canceled weeks ago. What is going on?" "I decided not to continue funding this year's reunion expenses," I said calmly, though my heart was pounding despite my steady voice. "Since I understand you and Michelle decided to handle organizing everything yourselves this year." There was a long pause on the line. "How did you even know about that?" Kevin finally asked, his voice quieter now, clearly beginning to understand the full situation. "I saw the group chat, Kevin," I said simply. "The one where you explained that things would be easier without my usual involvement this year. The one where you mentioned taking over the lodge arrangements yourselves without ever actually discussing any of this with me directly." Another long silence. "That wasn't supposed to," he started, then stopped himself. "Mom, that message wasn't meant for you to see. It came across wrong." Did it come across wrong, or did I simply see the honest version of a plan you and Michelle had been organizing behind my back for weeks? I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion building underneath it. Because from where I'm sitting, Kevin, it seems like I finally saw exactly what was actually happening, rather than the carefully managed version everyone else was being told. Kevin didn't have an immediate response to that. I could hear background noise on his end of the call, children's voices, general commotion, the sounds of a chaotic evening still unfolding around him. "You could have just talked to me about this," I continued gently but firmly. "If you and Michelle genuinely wanted to start taking over organizing responsibilities, if you felt ready to lead this tradition into its next chapter, I would have happily supported that transition. What I can't support is being quietly erased from something I built, while still being expected to fund it invisibly in the background." "We didn't think you'd actually pull your support," Kevin admitted quietly. "We figured you'd be upset about not attending, but we assumed you'd still, I don't know, still want the reunion itself to go well for everyone else." "I do want it to go well for everyone else," I said honestly. "But wanting something to succeed and being willing to invisibly fund my own exclusion from it are two very different things, Kevin. I hope you can understand that difference." We talked for nearly another hour that night, working through the situation as honestly as either of us could manage given the emotional weight of everything that had surfaced. Kevin admitted, gradually, that Michelle had been the primary driver behind the plan to exclude me, though he acknowledged his own responsibility in going along with it rather than pushing back or insisting on a more honest, direct conversation with me from the beginning. By the end of that conversation, we hadn't fully resolved everything, but something important had shifted. Kevin understood, clearly and completely, exactly why I had made the decision I made, and I understood more clearly the pressure and dynamics that had led him towards such a significant lapse in judgment regarding how our family's tradition should have been handled. The remainder of that reunion week unfolded very differently than any previous year. Kevin, working quickly the following morning, managed to arrange basic catering for the remaining days, though at considerably higher last-minute rates than my carefully planned advance bookings had ever required. Several family members, understanding the full situation by that point, generously offered to help cover some of the unexpected costs, wanting to ensure the children especially could still enjoy what remained of their week at the lake. I received updates throughout the week from various family members, several of whom reached out specifically to express their support and understanding regarding my decision. My sister-in-law Carol told me directly, "Diane, you gave that family 6 years of pure generosity. Nobody should have to fund their own exclusion. I'm proud of you for finally saying enough." Michelle, notably, didn't reach out to me at all during that week, though I later learned through Ashley that she remained largely defensive throughout the reunion, suggesting to various family members that I had overreacted to what she continued describing as simply a change in organizational leadership. I want to be honest about something important here. I didn't take any particular satisfaction in watching that reunion week unfold with such obvious challenges and chaos. My goal was never to sabotage my extended family's experience or to punish 40 relatives for decisions made entirely by Kevin and Michelle. My goal was simply to stop invisibly funding a tradition that had been deliberately taken away from me without honest conversation. About 3 weeks after the reunion concluded, Kevin reached out again, asking if we could meet in person to talk more thoroughly about everything that had happened, and importantly, about what the tradition might look like going forward. We met at a quiet restaurant near my home, and this time, Michelle joined the conversation as well, something I hadn't necessarily expected but genuinely appreciated as a sign of accountability from both of them. Michelle, somewhat reluctantly at first, acknowledged that the way they had approached the transition had been fundamentally unfair. "I think I convinced myself that if we just handled everything ourselves, it would be easier than having a difficult conversation directly with you," she admitted. "I see now how that came across as pushing you out entirely, rather than simply wanting more involvement in organizing things." I appreciated her honesty, though I made clear that acknowledging the mistake didn't automatically restore the trust that had been damaged. "I'm glad you're both seeing this more clearly now," I told them. "But I need you to understand, if we're going to continue this tradition together going forward, it has to happen through honest conversation, not through quiet plans I discover accidentally through a group chat." We spent much of that meeting discussing what a more collaborative approach might actually look like. Kevin and Michelle gradually taking on more organizing responsibilities over the coming years, with my continued involvement and financial support contingent on transparent, honest communication about any changes to the tradition going forward. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Some tension between Michelle and me remains, understandably, given everything that happened. But something important shifted during that meeting. Both Kevin and Michelle finally understood, clearly and completely, that 6 years of quiet generosity had never meant I would simply accept being erased from my own family's tradition without consequence. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this: generosity should never be mistaken for weakness, and quiet support should never be assumed to be unconditional regardless of how you're treated in return. For 6 years, I gave freely to my family's tradition, expecting nothing in return except the simple joy of watching everyone stay connected across generations. I never imagined that same generosity could eventually be used against me, quietly redirected to fund a version of the tradition that no longer included me at all. To anyone listening who recognizes a similar pattern in their own life, perhaps you've been the quiet, generous supporter of something important, only to find yourself gradually pushed toward the margins while your contributions continue being expected regardless. I want you to understand something important. You are allowed to stop funding your own exclusion. You are allowed to expect honest, direct conversation before significant changes are made to something you built. And you are absolutely allowed to withdraw your support, calmly and without excessive drama, when that support has been taken for granted rather than genuinely appreciated. Kevin and Michelle's plan wasn't actually about improving our family's tradition. It was about convenience, dressed up as leadership, executed through secrecy rather than honest collaboration. When that secrecy finally surfaced, the natural consequence wasn't cruelty on my part. It was simply the removal of support that had never actually been guaranteed unconditionally, regardless of how I was treated. Our family's tradition continues, though in a different, more collaborative form now. Last summer's reunion, our seventh, was smaller than previous years, but it was honest, organized together, with open conversation about expenses, responsibilities, and decisions, rather than quiet plans made behind anyone's back. I don't regret the difficult, uncomfortable lesson that first chaotic reunion week taught our entire family. Sometimes, the clearest way to help people understand the true value of your generosity is to briefly, calmly, allow them to experience exactly what happens in its absence. If this story resonated with you, remember, being generous doesn't mean accepting mistreatment silently. Real appreciation requires honest conversation, not quiet assumption that support will simply continue regardless of how you're treated. The people who truly value what you contribute will tell you so directly, rather than quietly planning around your absence. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay with us for more true stories of family, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to finally stop funding your own exclusion.